Hi, everyone. Welcome in to our second in our series of webinars in growth based grading for nursing education. I'm Dave Friedman,
I'm Danny Miller.
and this is what we are calling Walking the Talk. So, in this presentation today, we're going to take you through our norms and guiding principles, which haven't changed from the last time. We have an anticipatory set. We're going to talk a lot about our story and the shifts that we've made, and then we're going to work through exploring the four shifts that we have before we give you some time to reflect and close here at the end.
So, again, everyone, we like to really center ourselves in our norms and guiding principles as we move into our sessions, as we move into our experiences together. And so, again, we want to start by centering your policy, which is, again, we believe that everyone participating in our activities is intelligent, capable, and cares about doing their best and wants to improve. I love that growth based sentiment there that I really hear quite clearly at the end. Today, everyone, as we launch into our session, think about which of our 5 norms as well you might be focusing on and taking with you into the session. I always love to focus on producing learning artifacts.
Yeah, and I really am a big fan of the grades are temporary and the skills are forever. So today, as we get into our session outline, really what we're trying to do here is we're trying to identify and connect the shifts that we're making here and really trying to put a name to them and try to make sure that they make sense to you. And so you can see some of the things that we've done and some of the ways that we've built upon that.
Exactly. We're also going to be really focused on exploring how these shifts are really made clear in classroom structures, clinical structures, and the design elements. And the design elements that form culture, that form routines, that form protocols, and that really create growth based practices at the core of all of the practices that we do in our classrooms.
Exactly. And then we'll have a little bit of time here at the end for you to reflect on some of the strategies that we've talked about and really think about how they might work in your context here going forward.
And so we really want to make sure that we're centering the purpose, the larger purpose for this work that we're doing here, which is again the larger shifts that AACN is asking schools across the country to be making in their curriculum and in their frameworks, right? Growth-based grading philosophies, tools, and methodologies do support that shift that AACN has to really move away from task-based structures and more into skill acquisition that supports dynamic and critical responses in a very dynamic and critical field, right? In session one, we looked at philosophy. We took sort of a 30,000-foot approach. And today we'll kind of look at what that philosophy means in everyday implementation and practices.
So, welcome. We're excited that you're here today. If you would take a second and use the QR code and or the link in the chat to look for our session guide for today. Special thank you to our facilitators for again taking our work and relaying it to the masses.
And so this is the first place where you're going to be using that session guide, everyone, if you choose to. And we've got another spot for that session, that QR code over to the side. And we really want you to think about some transformations that we've made as individuals, that our society has made over time. We've got a little sample list down below. You might want to pick one of these, maybe a similar one that you've maybe encountered in your own life. And think about the small shifts that that larger transformation was made up of, right? We have the question in the session guide as well, everyone. Think about this shift from physical music to digital music, right?
Yeah. Or maybe what it was like when you lived with your parents, however long ago that might have been, to what it's like living with others, or maybe even living on your own.
Yeah, a shift that I've made really recently in my life was moving from a gas vehicle to a electric style vehicle. So that kind of shift that I had to make in my everyday practices.
Yeah. And then we've all made the shift from being students to being educators. And then some of us make the shift from being educators back into being students. It's kind of in flux at times, but that's another one that could be an example of it.
And we've also got the shift from radio to television to internet, away from print structures, more into digital structures, right? There's all of these shifts that we've accomplished as individuals and as societies.
So as you come in and as you get set and as you take a look at the session guide, if you would please think about those shifts and think about what was required in order to make that transformation possible. And then maybe pick one word or two words to describe that shift in that transformation and post it in the chat so we can have a little bit of a conversation about it. We're going to hit a quick pause in our video right now. So if you, as people come in, but when you are ready, we will go ahead and we will pick it up on our next slide. And we are back. So what we wanted to do with this section was take a moment and really ground you in our story and some of the things that we did as we incorporated growth-based grading into our secondary high school classroom over the last few years.
Yeah, and really what we're going to do is we're focusing in on the first 2 years of this process. And it is a growing and evolving process, as many processes are, right? But year one was Dave and I, it was our first year really working together, right?
That's right.
As we were working together in AP Lang, AP English Language and Composition, for those of you out there. You had, I believe, just one section of
That's
the
correct.
course. And so I was teaching 3 sections of the course, I believe, that first year. And so we knew that we wanted to do something different. We knew that the curriculum really was difficult. We knew that it was hard to keep students engaged because of the growth curve that they had to hit from the gate. And so we walked into that first year recognizing some different approaches, right?
Yeah, the really thing for me that was the catalyst for this was the idea that students always came up to me and asked me, how do I get an A on this assignment? How do I get an A in the class? And I always wanted to tell them that it was more about the skill than it was about the grades. But my grade book wasn't reflecting that, and my practices weren't reflecting that. So in that first year, what we really did was we focused on those competencies and those through lines and where those skills showed up. More than looking at the task or looking at
Right.
the behavior, we really tried to make sure that we looked at what our course description said, sort of the same way that the AACN lays out a lot of those strategies and
Right.
those standards for us as well. And then we found out where those might appear in the things that we were already doing.
Right. And we also took some of these larger conversations that were happening in the district that we worked in around, rolling grade books and shifting those kind of structures. And we sort of tried to put those two things together because we felt like it worked especially well in a skills development course, right? Building skills around reading and writing doesn't happen in one day, doesn't happen in one lesson. And so we knew that having that structure to support some of our assessment structures would probably lead to good outcomes for us in our classrooms.
Yeah. And so another big shift that we made was asking students to really use the language of the course.
Yeah.
And by using the language of the course, what that did is it helped to shift from how do I get an A on this assessment into how do I improve my skill in a certain area.
Right.
And that really led to a much deeper understanding of what we were doing there. It didn't become about any one individual test or any one individual essay that they were writing, but more it was about how do I master the skills in order to do that. And
Right.
that really led to our growth, development, and productive positivity that we had. And we also really built relationships both with each other through
Right.
working together, but also with those students so that when it came time to ultimately assess them, we not only knew them through their work, but we knew them through themselves, through
And
humanity.
Exactly. And we were really consistent in kind of understanding that very individualized approach to each student, and they could kind of have ownership of their data, of their assessments, of their feedback in a way that I don't think had ever happened in my classroom before.
Mhm.
It wasn't every kid, right? It wasn't every student. We definitely had some speed bumps, which again, it took time to get kids on board because we were the only classes really doing this.
And they had built this mindset over time of this is what school is.
Right.
It is task based. It is rewarding me for working and not necessarily for quality every time. Different teachers expect different things, so I have to learn what their class expects before I'm able to really perform at a high level. And this idea that they had to maintain excellence throughout, which
Right.
isn't a realistic standard to have for anyone who's approaching anything with any sort of challenge or rigor.
Exactly. And we also recognized that we had some vestiges, some old practices that kind of mixed in because we didn't maybe give ourselves the time we needed. We didn't kind of make a full break from some of those structures that, again, were still everywhere around us in the practice.
We were also bound by some of the county policies that we had, and
True.
that's one of the nice things about working in a school of nursing is that you can determine a lot of those policies for yourself about what you want to do and how you want to grade.
Exactly.
So the way that we responded to this was really by digging into our course and exam description and our standards that we were really looking at the big ideas
Mhm.
that were laid out
Mhm.
by AP.
Yeah, and we were really looking as well at how the larger framework kind of could be modeled in a lot of the things that we were doing in all of the documents and all of the elements. We really wanted to bake everything throughout. So we started with our syllabus. We started by shifting into really embracing the language of AP, the language of the standards and the curriculum, the language of the competencies, as AACN would put it. We put that front and center of our syllabus, our assessment, and our feedback tools because we wanted to make sure that we were consistently having the conversation around the skills and the competencies of the course.
And then once we developed those skills and competencies of the course, we didn't deviate from them. What we did was we used them over and over and over again on every assessment and every bit of feedback that we had. And this really aligned our assessments to the essential standards that were outlined in our curriculum rather than looking for things that we might have been assessed on as students or
Mhm.
that our colleagues were assessing on. What we had was we had the language of the course and we had fidelity between the two of us
Right.
so that we were assessing the same thing at the same time in the same way using the same tools and the same language.
Right, exactly. So there was that standardization that allowed us to be able to then respond to the individual students, right? I think that that standardization helped us to get to the conversations that we needed to have a lot faster, right? And again, that kind of helped us in understanding how we could adjust our calendar because we realized there's really no such thing as quarters anymore for us. We're not really functioning in that framework, so we don't need to anymore, right? Every day the grade can be what the grade is,
Mhm. We
right?
thought of the course as though it was confined to the year in there. Theoretically, in high school, students should have 4 years to master standards, but it doesn't ever work like that.
Unfortunately.
And so what we did was we sort of put everything into one and we said, listen, y'all, we don't need you to be excellent in August or September or October. We really need you to try to be excellent in April and May and June.
Right. And so again, like that's a place where we made a shift that might be approaching something that you already have in the idea that it's at the end of the semester, right? That's when excellence really needs to be, right? Or at
Or
the end of the program. That's when you need to be able to do all of the things.
which is one of the ways that AACN aligns its rubric in order to help meet students in growth and allow them to get to the next place that they might need to be.
We also recognize that we were able to then bring more practices outside of the classroom into our meetings and our collaboration times and the department meetings and so on and so forth that then supported us inside of the classroom to do more of the work that we really felt like we needed to be doing.
Yeah, by planning together and by making our assessments together, but continuing to use the same rubric all of the time, it really, many hands made light work.
Mhm.
And not only that, we didn't have students who would leverage us against each other and say, oh, in that section, it's a little bit different. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we
Exactly.
go forward.
And so then we got to our second year, right? And we noticed that the kids had talked over the summer. The data that we got from our exam that first year was solid data. We grew from the previous year, even though we had also increased our enrollment. We increased our overall proficiency, which was always a nice thing to see. And we noticed that at the beginning of the year, students were coming to us kind of already understanding that this was going to be a little bit different than their typical AP class or their typical English class, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. We had also heard that students were comparing their experiences across schools, and we were understanding that again, the parents and the students were really seeing the breakthroughs, and that conversation supported us a lot in year two.
Yeah, and so they knew what to expect a little bit, which really helped. And then we changed our messaging just slightly as we went forward. And we started to really talk about, because in the previous year we had said things like, this doesn't matter. And so what we really should have said is that everything matters. It just doesn't average into your final grade until the end. And so you get a chance to practice and practice and practice. And this led to us de weaponizing failure. And
Hmm.
we really focused on learning and growth as it went forward. And as I said before, it became conversations about how do I build this skill? How do I gain proficiency in this competency rather than how do I get an A on the Great Gatsby essay or whatever assignment it happened to be.
Exactly, Dave. And the kids were able to kind of figure out their routes to success in the various tasks and assessments that we were having them to do. They were able to kind of see how success in some assessments was able to then bridge them to others because they could see the ways that the skills and the competencies were connecting to each other because our messaging was reinforcing that consistently.
We also found that students, by looking at the data in this way, found consistencies and inconsistencies in their own work. And so they would recognize trends of the skills that they were proficient in and then the skills which they were lacking in, which allowed them to hyper focus on that, which streamlined our assessment and our feedback and our planning because we could see those same trends as well.
Exactly. And so again, like as we moved through the year, we found that our cycle of planning, assessment, feedback got tighter and tighter and better as we kept moving through the year. We were dropping off things that were no longer serving us and focusing only on the essentials. Did that mean that sometimes they weren't doing as much work as they had done before? Yes, but we recognize that rigor doesn't mean more. It means depth, it means understanding, it means higher levels of complexity.
Mhm. And the level to which they understood really led to like these consistent equitable outcomes that we were really looking for there, that these students knew what was expected of them and they knew that their classmates were expected to do the same thing and they knew that they what they were going to be tested on at any time and the path that they needed to take in order to achieve at a high level for
Exactly.
those things.
Exactly.
And so by removing sort of the mystery behind it and showing them, hey, this is the clear path to success, it not only allowed them to feel empowered, but it almost gave us like we were co-teaching
With our students.
with our students at times.
Yeah. And I think like again, like they because we kept having that same conversation all year from day 1 to day 90, they were able to understand it at when they could, right? When they were able to understand it. And once they got it, they didn't have to get anything else.
So let's take a moment really quickly and let's dig into really what we did here. It's nice to talk about the theory and it's nice to talk about the outcomes, but let's talk about how the rubber meets the road in this particular instance. So we're going to take a deep look here at syllabus language as well as calendar and pacing shifts.
And we wanted to start with these two because we really think that because of the way that some of you are writing your syllabus, this calendar pacing shifts could align very easily within that document, right? And so, again, we looked at first getting rid of what did not serve us in our syllabus. And we recognized that in our course, we were teaching a separate curriculum from the standard English curriculum. And so we streamlined and coded our language to focus on those essential skills and those essential outcomes. Our students were taking this exam measured these skills, so that's what the course was about consistently.
Although I will say that when you boil it down, it's just reading and writing, which made it really simple to align with the skills of our department
Exactly.
as well. One of the other big shifts that we did was we removed the late penalties for late work. One thing that we found is that students might submit late work for any reason, but the quality of their work really was what we were looking for. We were
Mhm.
trying to assess skills. And by not making it a culture of punishment, we found that students would give us quality work that they were giving time for and not necessarily work that they had AI'd or otherwise cheated on in order to get it in on time in order to get a high grade and meet the deadline.
Exactly, because we were recognizing that again, by removing that barrier, we were getting them to engage more deeply in the assessment and the skill that we needed them to engage in, right? And that was part of the way that we warmed up our language and our tone to reflect that learner theory and practice to support them in that development to kind of coach those failures and those missteps into the larger framework. I found that for me as a teacher, I didn't find myself getting so anxious about chasing down every missing assignment or every following up with every absence, because again, like, I knew that there was another one coming. I could kind of make the conversation about the future rather than holding them accountable for that past.
Exactly. And this really it goes back to the idea of the skills over the grades and producing learning artifacts and things like that. And so by clarifying and focusing the language on growth for grading and reporting, like I've said a couple of times in here, we shifted our conversations in here. And so students began to understand and began to see that we weren't just trying to get them to get an A, but we wanted them to have those skills that were going to last them beyond our classroom. And
Hmm.
so, and the other thing that we did was we kept coming back to the syllabus. We kept coming back to these are the main things, reading and writing skills that you'll be assessed on.
Hmm.
These are the ways that we are measuring growth as we go forward. And we really want to make sure that those central philosophies of growth and understanding and compassionate equity were really at the forefront of what we were trying to do here.
And the syllabus became a tool then for our students to take to their parents to remind their parents about the policies and procedures as well, so that we could be speaking that same language amongst that whole team of support, right? Because that we had to realize that we were also shifting parent mindsets as well.
Yeah.
And then the shifts were also living in our calendar, in our unit plans, in our lesson plans, and so on and so forth. Because again, we recognized that we did not need students to be masters of these contents and masters of these skills until they sat for the exam in May. That's when they needed to perform. That's when the money really was on the table, right? And so we shifted the lens to really take the long view as opposed to chasing down every single month or every single quarter.
Yeah, and so for you as a nursing program, this might mean that they don't need to master the skills until the end of the program. We need to make sure that we are benchmarking and seeing progress on those skills, but we don't necessarily need them to be at an A until it's time to be at an A.
Hmm.
And so we can say to them, hey, you're not there yet on this, but here's a path to improvement. Here's a way to do this on your next DAP. Here's what we'd like to see, and here's where you can focus in order to demonstrate that skill. And so it becomes less about trying to get an A for a class and an A for a semester, or playing the game of, oh, I can skip this discussion board post because I know it's only worth 10 points, and really to, oh, I need to do that discussion board post because I need to show my professionalism skill to
Right.
my professor.
Right. And then that's discussion board post is going to set me up for later when I need to be performing this skill in the clinical environment or in the simulation environment, right?
Mhm.
What a lot of our students reflected on when we were kind of talking with them about this is that by not forcing them to go back and redo the previous assignment, but by paying it forward into the next similar type of assignment, they were then more focused on understanding what our feedback meant to them. They were more desirous of like applying that feedback in a way that would then move that needle for them. And when it didn't, they were the ones kind of beating down our doors to say, what didn't happen this time? Like, I thought I had it. Where did I go wrong? We were able to have the conversation that we needed to have with each student. And with sometimes the conversation was, you need to be doing more of this. You need to be more on top of your timing. You need to be more on top of maybe your outside of class situation so you can perform better here.
And so this brings us back to the idea of there really is no late penalty in there. We're going to reward you for doing what you've done and being where you are, and we need to have stuff in at a certain time so that we can give you timely feedback.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not as much about getting it in on time as it is about making sure that that skill is there, but also we need to make sure that feedback's there. And so that's why we say time is a suggestion until it's not, because we do need to have work in order to give feedback and in order to make sure that students are getting the most out of this experience.
Exactly. And that's where, again, what's really great about the framework that y'all have and what AACN kind of sets up is that professionalism competency band right there. that's where we can be assessing all of that timeliness and all of that sort of get showing up and doing the thing the way it needs to be done. That gives us that space. We don't have to necessarily have those late penalties in some of those other areas because that might muddy the waters of feedback.
Exactly. So let's take a minute and let's look at our shifts for 3 and 4 around assessment, practice, and routines.
And so the syllabus shifts and the calendar shifts really lived in the day to day practice in assessments, right? Assessments, as we all know, everyone are really kind of the thing that drive the class forward. They're the thing that produce the data that allow us to provide feedback and then tweak our future planning as we meet the students' needs that we see borne out by assessment. And so we clearly identified and coded the skills that were being assessed in every single one of our assessments. Thankfully, it allowed us to really see that sometimes we were over assessing things and we could kind of cut elements of the assessment to really get to what we wanted. And we were then able to have the students kind of on along the journey with us as they were creating more meaning out of their data. As they were tracking their progress, they could see those ups and those downs, those peaks and those valleys, and they understood what it meant in the same or similar way as we did.
Exactly. And so they really saw how one assignment played into the next one, and this gave them like a much better understanding of how to master a skill and how to achieve at a high level, not just how to get an A on a
Hmm.
task and then forget about it as they move on to the next one. And
Exactly.
so we really found the through lines in between our tasks within and among them, and how a skill from one assessment would help to carry them all the way through.
Remember that one kid who asked us when we got to the summative of a unit and they sort of stopped in the middle of doing their summative and they were like, aren't I just doing the same thing? And we were like, yeah, you are. You're just doing it at a higher level of complexity now. You mastered the earlier, simpler level. Now you're just taking it into a
Mhm.
slightly different place to show us that you can really do the full thing. Oh, that completely makes sense.
I like to think about it in terms of like a sports metaphor, and that if you're on a soccer team, every time you play soccer, you're playing soccer, but you play it against a different team. And it's sort of the same way as like whenever you get a patient, you are doing nursing procedures, it's just with a different person with different
Exactly.
symptoms. And so we have to make sure that we're able to address all of those situations, but the skills themselves don't change.
And the students were able to recognize where those different levels of complexity were happening, right? And they could sort of recognize, oh, this is going to be difficult for me. This is a place where I'm maybe not as good as other places. How can I prepare myself for this? How can I use
Mhm.
my resources for this so I can be as successful as I possibly can be, right? That again allowed the students to kind of see how skills between, within, and among assessments, even within a single assessment, were really supportive of their overall success.
Mhm. The other shift that we really saw in here is by making this about the scoring guidelines and about the competencies and about the skills, what it does is it took us out as subjective
Hmm.
individuals, and it really made it more objective. We had students say to us, this is the first time that we had an English class, a writing class that felt like it was objective, because again, the skills were the skills were the skills, and the assessment was the assessment was the
And an
assessment.
A was an A was an A from the first day to the last day. It was an objective standard that they had to reach in order to get what that meant.
And so again, it shifted the conversation into, oh, my instructor, my professor, my teacher doesn't like me, more into that, oh, I need to work on this particular skill because I am only at this level and I'd like to raise it to a higher one.
And this is what that looks like, and so I can kind of build my way forward. And all of this lived, and I think, Dave, some of the things that you and I were doing outside of the classroom because they saw that we were a team. They saw, parents saw, administrators saw, everyone saw that we were really kind of marching to our own drum, but we were in lockstep with it because we were meeting all the time. We were meeting during class changes, we were checking in on how things were going. And I think that that led to us speaking the same language more consistently.
We made a purposeful point to meet every day.
Hmm.
And even if it was for 5 minutes, we met every day, and we had formal discussions and we had informal discussions about data and about instruction and about tweaks that we wanted to make going forward.
Yep.
We conferenced with each other and we also conferenced with students, and we tried to make sure that they were at the forefront of what we were doing. And really what that did was, by putting that student voice front and center, is it gave them agency not only to speak with us but to speak to their classmates.
Exactly. Exactly. Because they recognize that, again, we were all having the same conversation about the same things with the same tools. Another thing that I think really helped is that because of that similarity in framework, we were able to kind of create a hive mind ourselves when it came to what is this score like in this essay. And we then made that very transparent to the students, where we would say to them, oh, yeah, if you see it crossed out, that means that, Mr. Friedman might have been your back reader, or Mr. Miller was your back reader. And we talked about your scoring. We wanted to make sure that we were doing the thing that we needed to do.
Yeah, and by being that team and by showing them that we were on the same team, we had a reduced amount of cheating or infidelity within there, because they understood that they weren't going to be asked to do that same thing ever again. And
Mhm.
so they had to pull the skills out of it. And it drove them to us for conversations, it drove them to their classmates, it drove them to the online resources, and it made it less about grades and more about learning.
Exactly. And because we kept saying that from day one, we were saying that exact same thing, they then started buying into more doing those reflections and doing those assignments that weren't worth a grade. They were more willing to do those things because they could see the larger purpose of what we were asking them to do. And that's really, I think, one of those things that they saw in every single element of the course, that we were trying to facilitate a community that was focused on learning and growth and development, and not just passing an exam at the end of the year, right? If we facilitated that community, we would get to that outcome.
So, just a couple more minutes. Thank you so much for bearing with us today. So, we've looked at a lot of shifts that we've made to make growth-based grading a reality for all aspects of our classroom and possibly clinical experience as well. There's a lot of ways to put this philosophy into our design, and so we're just trying to share the things that worked for us
Hmm.
along the way, and maybe some paths that might work for you and for your learners as well.
Yeah, and I think too, as you maybe reflect on what you might remember from the first webinar, or from maybe looking at that pilot scoring tool, you might now see some of the shifts kind of put into those scoring tools and frameworks, right? The focus on explicit competencies, this focus on grading or explicit coding, the focus on objectivity. You might start seeing some of those elements a little bit more clearly now as you look back at some of those tools.
So, coming up next, what we're going to do is we're going to get into how to use that scoring guideline. We're going to hopefully have some student samples to apply it to. And we're going to really look at the way that how we, now that we've talked the walk, how we walk the walk.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to call it stretching our legs, because we're going to sort of warm up a little bit as we start applying this tool with simulated experiences that might ring true for some of your experiences in your classrooms.
Coming up in February.
And so, as we close today, everyone, again, thank you so much for being with us during this session, and uh, thanks to our facilitators as well. But we have our final question, everybody, in the session guide for you. And we really wanted you to think about our 4 shifts: the shifts around syllabus language, the shifts around calendar and pacing, the shifts around assessment approach, and the shifts around larger practices outside of the classroom. Which seems most approachable to you at this point right now? And maybe your context, maybe you're a distributed person out by yourself, maybe you're sitting with a team of faculty working in the same campus. What might seem a little bit far from you right now, a little bit more remote in terms of those shifts, because we want to think about both sides of that equation.
And then we also want to know where you're connecting, where you're resonating, where you're feeling good, and a few things that you might like to know about, especially as we move into our next part of the series. What can we explain a little bit better, a little bit more clearly to help y'all as you move forward?
Exactly.
So thank you so much for your time. We are D2 Educational Consulting. Once again, I'm Dave Friedman.
And I'm Danny Miller, and we've looked forward to having you today, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks as always.
Bye-bye.